Hello. In this story, we explore a man who did not conquer empires or lead armies. Instead, he invented the very way we remember empires and armies. He was a traveler, a refugee, and an endlessly curious observer. His name was Herodotus, and he gave the world the gift of history. Our story begins not with a war or a great coronation, but in a busy, noisy, and colorful port city called Halicarnassus, around the year 484 BC. Today, this city is known as Bodrum, a beautiful resort in modern-day Turkey. But 2,500 years ago, it was something much more important. It was a threshold. It was the literal dividing line between the world of the Greeks and the vast, powerful Persian Empire. This city was the perfect incubator for the man our story is about. He was not born in Athens, the center of Greek philosophy. He was not born in Sparta, the center of Greek military might. He was born on the edge, on the coast of Anatolia. To his west, across the Aegean Sea, lay the Greek islands and the mainland. To his east, just a few miles inland, began the territory of the Carians and the Lydians, and beyond them, the authority of the greatest superpower the world had ever known, Persia. Young Herodotus grew up hearing a symphony of different languages in the marketplace. He heard the sharp, clear tones of Ionian Greek from the sailors. He heard the rougher, native language of the Carians, the original inhabitants of the land, and he heard the formal, administrative language of Persian officials who governed the region. This mix was not just in the streets. It was in his blood. His family was wealthy, aristocratic, and influential. But they were not purely Greek. His name, Herodotus, is perfectly Greek. It means gift of the goddess Hera. But his father's name was Xerxes. His uncle's name was Panyasis. These are not Greek names. They are Carian. From the moment he was born, Herodotus was a product of two cultures. He was a bridge. This fact is the single most important key to understanding his entire life and character. For most Greeks living in Athens or Sparta, the world was simple. There were Greeks and then there was everyone else. The word they used for non-Greeks was barbarian. This word, barbaros, did not originally mean savage. It was an imitation of a sound. To the Greek ear, foreign languages sounded like a meaningless chatter. Bar, bar, bar. A barbarian was simply someone who did not speak Greek. It was a solid line dividing us from them. But Herodotus grew up on that very line. The barbarians were not mysterious monsters living over the horizon. They were his neighbors. They were his relatives. He knew from childhood that these other people had their own gods, their own complex histories, and their own fascinating customs that were just as valid as those of the Greeks. This upbringing gave him a gift that few of his contemporaries possessed, an open mind. He was born without the prejudice of the center. The political situation of his city was just as complex. Halicarnassus was a Greek city, but it was not free. It was a subject state, a client of the Persian Empire. The city paid taxes to the great king in Persia and was expected to provide ships and soldiers when he demanded them. And here, we meet a fascinating and little-known figure who certainly shaped young Herodotus's view of the world. At the time of his birth, Halicarnassus was not ruled by a man. It was ruled by a queen. Her name was Artemisia. In a Greek world where most women, especially in cities like Athens, were kept in seclusion, Herodotus grew up in a city governed by a brilliant and ruthless stateswoman. Artemisia was so capable that she personally commanded her own squadron of warships. And she did not fight for the Greeks. She fought for the Persians. She was one of the most trusted commanders of the Persian king Xerxes during his massive invasion of Greece. Herodotus, writing about this war decades later, treats her with obvious respect, even admiration. He tells a famous story of how, during the chaos of the Battle of Salamis, Artemisia's ship was being cornered by a Greek vessel. To escape, she turned and rammed a different ship, a Persian ally, sinking it instantly. The Greek captain, seeing this, assumed she must be on his side and broke off the pursuit. King Xerxes, watching from a throne on the shore, was impressed by her tactical boldness, not knowing she had just sunk one of his own ships. He famously remarked, "My men have become women, and my women men." This was the world that formed Herodotus, a world where cultural lines were blurry, a world where a woman could be a fearsome naval commander, a world where the enemy, the Persians, were also the ultimate source of law, order, and political power. His education was not just in a classroom. His education was the port. As a boy from a rich shipping family, he would have sat in the warehouses and on the docks, listening to stories from sailors and merchants who had just returned from the furthest corners of the known world. They told him of Egypt, a land so ancient it made Greece look like a child, a land where people worshipped gods with the heads of animals and built mountains of stone for their dead kings. They told him of Phoenicia, the land of purple dye, whose sailors claimed to have sailed all the way around Africa. They told him stories of Scythia, the frozen land to the north, where nomadic horsemen drank from the skulls of their enemies. And they told him of Babylon, the magnificent heart of the Persian Empire, a city with walls so thick that 2 chariots could race on top of them. These stories lit a fire in his mind. He realized that the epic poems of Homer, which all Greek children learned, told only one small part of the human story. He became obsessed with a simple question: why? Why did the Egyptians worship crocodiles? Why did the Persians not build statues to their gods? Why did the Lydians invent coinage? And most of all, the great question of his age: why, only a few years before he was born, had the tiny, fractured world of Greece come into such a catastrophic and unlikely conflict with the massive Persian Empire? He wanted to know the real story, the human story behind the myths. This curiosity, born in the melting pot of Halicarnassus, would define his entire life. But his comfortable life as a young aristocrat was about to be shattered. The political stability of his hometown was fragile. The queen, Artemisia, was eventually succeeded by her grandson, a man named Lygdamis. And Lygdamis was a tyrant. He ruled with a heavy hand, and he did not tolerate dissent from the wealthy families. Herodotus's own family, possibly his uncle Panyasis, became involved in a plot against the tyrant. The plot failed. Lygdamis cracked down hard. And just like that, Herodotus, now a young man, lost everything. He was forced to flee his home, his wealth, and his city. He became a political exile, a refugee. This single event, exile, was the furnace that forged his character. Had he remained a wealthy aristocrat in Halicarnassus, he might have become a minor politician or a successful merchant. But as a refugee, his destiny was completely altered. He, along with his family, found a new home on the island of Samos. Samos was a powerful, wealthy, and fiercely independent Greek island. It was a hub of Ionian thought, trade, and incredible feats of engineering, like the Great Tunnel of Eupalinos, a massive aqueduct dug straight through a mountain. Here, Herodotus was safe. But he was no longer an insider. He was an alien, a resident, but not a true citizen. This status of being an outsider is a powerful psychological force. It strips you of your local prejudices. You are no longer focused on the day-to-day politics of your city, because it is no longer your city. Instead, you begin to see the bigger picture. You stop being a participant and you become an observer. This change was everything. His curiosity, born in the port of his hometown, now had a purpose. He was no longer just a boy listening to sailors' tales. He was a man who had lost his place in the world and needed to find a new one. He began to listen to the stories in the port of Samos not just with wonder, but with a critical ear. He started to compare the stories. He noticed contradictions. If a sailor from Egypt said one thing, and a merchant from Phoenicia said another, who was right? If the priests on Samos told one story about the gods, and his Carian relatives back home told another, what was the truth? This is the moment his curiosity hardened into a method. He was a man without a traditional career path. The political life of his home was closed to him. The family business was likely confiscated or disrupted by the tyrant. So he invented his own profession, a profession that had never existed before. He would become an investigator of the world. The very word he used for his project, Historia, is the key. To us, history means the study of the past. But in the Greek of his day, Historia did not mean that at all. It was an active verb. It meant to inquire, to investigate, to ask questions. It's the word a detective would use. It's the word a scientist would use. Herodotus was not setting out to write history. He was setting out on a great investigation. And he had the means to do it. His family, though exiled, was still wealthy and had connections across the Greek world. He was not a poor refugee. He was an educated, well-funded aristocrat with no political obligations and an infinite amount of time. He was perfectly free. He would no longer rely on the second-hand stories he heard in the ports. He would use his wealth and his freedom to go and see for himself. He would travel to the ends of the earth, not to trade or to conquer, but simply to know. He would collect the stories and customs of all mankind, compare them, and present them to the world. His life was no longer defined by the city he had lost. It would be defined by the world he was about to find. And for any Greek of that era, there was only one possible place to begin such a journey: the oldest, wisest, and most profoundly strange civilization known to them. A land that was already ancient when the heroes of the Trojan War were just legends. The land of the pharaohs, the pyramids, and the great river that seemed to flow from the wrong direction. He packed his things and set sail for Egypt. His arrival in Egypt was a profound shock. To a Greek, the world was built on change, debate, and human-scale gods. Egypt was the opposite. It was a civilization built on permanence, divine order, and a sense of time so deep it was almost geological. For a Greek, a building that was a few hundred years old was ancient. In Egypt, Herodotus was shown temples and statues that the priests claimed were thousands of years old. And they had the records to prove it. He traveled the country extensively, likely during the period when Egypt was, like his own home, under Persian control. This political reality actually made his journey easier. The Persian Empire maintained roads, offered security for travelers, and he, as a subject of the empire from Halicarnassus, could move about freely. He journeyed up the Nile from the delta in the north, past the bustling city of Memphis, all the way to Elephantine, an island near the first great rapids of the river, the traditional southern border of Egypt. And everywhere he went, he did one thing. He asked questions. He was not a tourist simply admiring the sights. He was an investigator. He interviewed the priests in the temples. He talked to the local guides. He hired interpreters. He spoke to the common people. He was relentless. And he employed a new revolutionary method. He tried to separate what he saw from what he heard. In his great work, he is very careful to make distinctions. He will say, "This is what I saw with my own eyes." He will say, "This is what the priests of Egypt told me." And often he will add, "For my part, I am not required to believe everything I am told, but I am required to report it." This was revolutionary. He was giving his audience the raw data, the sources, and allowing them to make their own judgments. What he saw amazed him. He declared that Egypt was a land of wonders, and that in all its customs, it seemed to reverse the common practices of mankind. He noted with fascination that in Egypt, women went to the market and engaged in trade, while men stayed at home and wove cloth. This was a complete reversal of the Greek custom. He described the Egyptians' profound religious devotion. He was fascinated by their worship of animals. He learned that the cat was a sacred animal. He tells the story, perhaps with some exaggeration, that if a house caught on fire, the Egyptians would stand guard not to save the house, but to prevent their cats from running into the flames. When a cat died of natural causes, he wrote, the entire household would shave their eyebrows in mourning. He described the worship of the Apis bull, a sacred bull believed to be the living incarnation of a god, chosen for its special markings. He saw the crocodile, a creature of terror to other men, being tamed by the priests, fed, and adorned with gold jewelry in its ears. But the sacred crocodile was not the only mystery of the Egyptian river. The river itself, the Nile, was the greatest puzzle of all. To a Greek, all rivers swelled in winter with the rains, and grew shallow in the summer heat. The Nile did the exact opposite. It began to rise in June at the peak of summer, flooding the land and depositing the rich black silt that gave Egypt its life. Then it receded during the cool winter. This was a profound violation of nature as he knew it, and it became one of his greatest investigations. He did what he always did. He asked questions. He first asked the Egyptians, but he found they had no scientific answer. To them, the flood was simply the will of the gods. It was the lifeblood of their nation, an event to be celebrated, not questioned. So Herodotus turned to the theories of his fellow Greeks, which he meticulously records, only to debunk them one by one. One theory suggested it was the Etesian winds, strong summer winds, blowing south and backing up the river. Herodotus dismissed this. He had seen other rivers that flowed against these same winds, and they showed no such effect. A second, more popular theory was that the Nile flowed from the great ocean that was believed to encircle the world. Herodotus found this idea even more ridiculous, dismissing it as the stuff of poetry and myth, not observation. A third theory, and the most modern sounding, was that the Nile's flood was caused by melting snow. Herodotus found this the most foolish of all. He argued, with the powerful logic of his time, that the Nile flowed from the south, from Libya, a land he understood to be the hottest and driest place on earth. The very idea of snow in such a region was, to him, a complete impossibility. Having dismissed the theories of others, he offered his own. His theory was complex, involving the path of the sun, which he believed was blown south by winter storms, pulling water with it. His theory was, of course, completely wrong. He had no knowledge of the monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands, which were the true source of the flood. But what is revolutionary here is not the answer. It is the method. He took a great natural mystery, gathered all the available data, applied logical deduction, and attempted to find a rational, naturalistic cause, rejecting all supernatural explanations. He was, in this moment, the world's first scientific geographer. This sense of ancient, rational power was everywhere. He traveled to the great cities of Memphis and Thebes. And in Thebes, he had an encounter that must have shattered his Greek worldview. He spoke to the high priests, and just as he had done in other temples, he asked them about their gods and the history of their nation. He likely told them the Greek stories, how the gods like Heracles and Dionysus had walked the earth only a few generations before the Trojan War. The priests listened patiently. Then they took him into a great inner hall of the temple, and they showed him a row of massive wooden statues. The priests explained that each statue represented a high priest, a father succeeded by his son, in an unbroken line. They began to count them. 1, 2, 50, 100, 200. The line of statues went on and on, generation after generation, disappearing into the temple's shadows. When they had finished, they had counted 341 statues. 341 generations of high priests. This, they explained, was the history of their temple before the first Greek gods were even supposed to have been born. They told him that in all this time, over 11,000 years by their calculation, no god had ever walked the earth in human form, as the Greeks claimed. For Herodotus, this was a revelation of deep time. The history of his own people, the Trojan War, the heroes he had grown up with, it all shrank into insignificance. It was a single fleeting moment compared to the vast recorded antiquity of Egypt. And again, he did not reject this. He did not dismiss it as a barbarian lie. He recorded it, with humility and with awe. And then, of course, he came to the greatest wonders of all, the monuments that even then were ancient beyond comprehension. He stood before the great pyramids of Giza. He was filled with a practical Greek curiosity, not just who built this, but how. He measured the base of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, or Cheops as he calls him, and found it to be 800 feet on each side, a remarkably close calculation. He asked his interpreters, the local guides he had hired, about the construction. He describes the pharaoh Cheops as a cruel tyrant who enslaved his people for this project. He writes that it took 100,000 men, working in 3-month shifts, 20 years to build the great monument. These numbers are almost certainly exaggerations, fed to him by his guides, but he recorded them faithfully. And then, he gives us a detail so specific, so human, it could only have come from a true investigator. He asked his interpreter to translate an inscription on the side of the pyramid. The interpreter told him that the inscription recorded the total amount of money spent on food for the workers. It detailed the vast sums for radishes, onions, and garlic. This is pure Herodotus. He is fascinated not just by the monumental, but by the mundane. He wanted to know the logistics, the cost, the fuel that drove this great human engine. He even tried to calculate how much the iron tools must have cost, marveling at the expense. He also recorded the method of construction. He was told the pyramid was built in steps, and that the great stones were lifted from one level to the next using machines made of short wooden planks. This description has launched over 2,000 years of debate, with modern engineers building replicas based on his account, trying to rediscover the technique. Yet for Herodotus, there was one structure in Egypt that was even more marvelous than the pyramids. It was a place called the Labyrinth. He claimed to have seen this one with his own eyes. It was a gigantic building near a place called the City of the Crocodiles. He described it as a massive roofed complex of 2 levels, containing 3,000 rooms. 1,500 rooms were above ground, and 1,500 were below. He wrote that the upper rooms surpassed all human imagination. He wandered through an endless maze of courtyards, colonnades, and halls, all linked by winding passages. He said that the complexity was baffling, and that the walls and roof were made entirely of massive polished stone, covered in carved figures. He declared, if one were to put together all the buildings of the Greeks, they would not be found to have cost so much labor and money as this one labyrinth. But the most mysterious part was what he was not allowed to see. The Egyptian guardians of the labyrinth refused to let him enter the 1,500 rooms underground. They told him these were the sacred tombs, holding the remains of the kings who had built the labyrinth, and the tombs of the sacred crocodiles. These underground rooms were tombs. This vast, powerful civilization, he realized, was organized around death. The tombs of the kings, the tombs of the sacred animals. This obsession with preserving the body was the key to their entire culture, and he was about to investigate that custom in its most intimate and famous detail. His investigation into the Egyptian reverence for the body led him to one of his most famous and detailed reports. He asked a simple, practical question. How did they do it? How did the Egyptians preserve a human body so perfectly against the decay of time? What he learned was that mummification was not a single secret. It was a professional service, a craft, offered at different price points. When a man of means died, his family would take the body to a special class of craftsmen, the embalmers. Herodotus explains that the embalmers would first show the family a set of painted wooden models, small statues carved to look like mummies. They would present them as a kind of menu. This, they would say, pointing to the first model, is the most expensive method, the one associated with the god Osiris. It will cost this much. This second one, they would continue, is a less expensive method and not as thorough. And this third one, they would conclude, is the cheapest method of all. The family would negotiate the price, choose the model, and once the bargain was struck, they would leave the body with the craftsmen, who would then begin their sacred and secret work. Herodotus, with his relentless curiosity, managed to learn the details of all three methods. He describes the first, most expensive method with fascinated horror. It was a process that, to a Greek, must have seemed like a combination of surgery and ritual. The first step, he explains, was to deal with the brain. The embalmers understood that the brain was soft tissue and would be the first part to decay. Using a crooked iron hook, they would break through the thin ethmoid bone at the top of the nasal cavity. They would then insert the hook and pull out parts of the brain through the nostrils. Other parts of the brain they would dissolve by pouring in special drugs, or pharmaca. To a Greek, the brain was the seat of reason. This brutal, mechanical removal must have been deeply shocking. But to the Egyptians, the heart, not the brain, was the center of intelligence and personality, and the heart was almost always left inside the body. Next, the craftsman would take a sharp stone knife, often made of obsidian or Ethiopian flint, and make a precise incision along the man's flank. Through this cut, they would pull out all the internal organs: the stomach, the intestines, the liver, and the lungs. They would clean these organs, wash them in palm wine, and sprinkle them with ground spices. Then they would place them in special vessels, what we now call canopic jars, to be buried with the mummy. The body cavity itself was then thoroughly cleansed. They would rinse it with more palm wine, a natural antiseptic, and then with an infusion of ground spices. Once the body was empty and clean, the most crucial stage began. The embalmers would fill the cavity with temporary packing, perhaps linen or straw, and then cover the entire body with a substance called natron. This was the key. Herodotus describes it simply, but natron was a natural salt, a mixture of baking soda and salt, harvested from dry lake beds in the desert. It was a powerful desiccant. The body was left buried in a great heap of this dry natron for exactly 70 days. Herodotus is very precise on this point. He states it could not be left for longer than 70 days. During this time, the natron drew all the moisture from the flesh, the muscles, and the skin, perfectly preserving the body but leaving it shrunken and leathery. After the 70 days, the body was removed. The temporary stuffing was taken out, and the body was washed one last time. It was now dry, sterile, and permanent. The embalmers would then fill the empty sunken cavity with new, permanent materials: bags of powdered myrrh, cassia, and other expensive perfumes and spices. They did not use frankincense. Then, they sewed the incision in the flank back up. The final stage was the wrapping. The body was carefully and tightly wound in hundreds of yards of fine linen bandages, cut into strips. The craftsman would use a special gum or resin to glue the layers of linen together, creating a hard protective shell around the preserved body. The man was now a mummy. He was returned to his family, who would then place him in a custom-made wooden coffin, often carved and painted in the likeness of the deceased. This coffin, Herodotus notes, was then stood upright against a wall in a special tomb or a dedicated room in the family home. This was the process for the rich. But Herodotus, ever the thorough investigator, also asked about the other options. What about the middle class? He explains the second method. The embalmers would not make a cut in the body. Instead, they would use a large syringe to inject the body, through the anus, with a quantity of cedar oil. They would then plug the body and leave it in the natron for the required 70 days. After the 70 days, they would unplug the body, and the oil would drain out, and with it, all the dissolved internal organs. The natron would have eaten away the soft flesh, leaving only skin and bone. This husk was then returned to the family, a simpler and less complete preservation. Finally, he asked about the third method, the cheapest one for the poor. In this case, he was told, the embalmers would simply purge the intestines with a strong liquid, likely a harsh enema. Then, they would place the body in the natron for 70 days, and return it. No wrapping, no spices, no surgery. Just the raw, desiccating power of the salt. This account is extraordinary. It is the single most detailed description of mummification to survive from the ancient world. And for millennia, historians and priests had read it with skepticism. It seemed too graphic, too strange to be real. Then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, modern archaeologists and scientists began to chemically analyze mummies. They confirmed every major point of Herodotus's story. They found traces of palm wine. They found resin. They found the incision in the flank. They found bodies packed with myrrh and cassia. They even analyzed the natron, confirming its composition. His account, once dismissed as a traveler's tale, was vindicated as a piece of brilliant, accurate investigative reporting. His journey through Egypt gave him more than just facts. It gave him a new perspective on time, on the gods, and on human customs. He left the land of the Nile not as a Greek, but as something new, a student of the world. And his journey was far from over. From the oldest civilization on earth, he set his sights on the newest and most powerful, the heart of the Persian Empire. From the ancient mystical land of Egypt, Herodotus traveled deep into the administrative and military heart of the world's reigning superpower. The Persian Empire was not a vague concept to him. He had grown up under its shadow. He spoke its languages. Now, he went to see the source of its power. His journey took him along the royal road, a marvel of engineering that connected the far-flung parts of the empire into Mesopotamia. He was heading for the empire's crown jewel, Babylon. His description of Babylon is one of the most vivid he ever wrote. And here, we must touch upon a great historical mystery. Scholars have debated for centuries. Did Herodotus actually see Babylon with his own eyes? In his text, his language changes. He rarely says, "I saw," as he did in Egypt. Many modern historians believe he never actually went. They argue that the city he describes, with its massive, perfect square walls and 100 bronze gates, does not match the archaeology. They suggest he probably made it as far as a Persian administrative capital, like Susa, where he interviewed officials and travelers who had been to Babylon. But what a report he gathered! He describes a city of breathtaking scale. He claims a great wall, so wide that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on top of it. As always, Herodotus was most fascinated by the people and their customs. He records traditions that were utterly alien to the Greek mind. The most famous is his description of the Babylonian marriage auction. He writes that once a year, in every village, all the young women old enough to marry were gathered in one place. A crier would then have them stand up, one by one, and he would auction them off. He would begin with the most beautiful woman in the group. The wealthy men would bid against each other, offering huge sums of gold to marry her. When a high price was agreed, the crier would take the money. Then he would bring forward the second most beautiful, and so on. But what happened to the money? This is the part Herodotus admired. The money gathered from selling the beautiful brides was not kept by the state. It was used to create a dowry fund. After all the attractive women were gone, the crier would bring forward the least attractive ones. Now, the auction was reversed. The crier would ask, "Who will marry this woman for the smallest amount of money?" The man who agreed to accept the smallest dowry would win her hand. The money collected from the rich, beautiful brides was used to pay the dowries for the less fortunate ones. In this way, Herodotus writes, the beautiful were a means of getting husbands for the ugly. He describes another custom, one so strange that many later historians used it as proof that he was a liar. He claimed that every woman born in Babylon, no matter how high-ranking, was required by law to do something once in her life. She had to go to the temple of the goddess Aphrodite, whom they called Melita, and sit in the sacred precinct. She would wait there until a male stranger came and threw a silver coin into her lap, saying, "I invoke the goddess Melita upon you." The coin could be of any value, but it was a sacred offering, and she was not allowed to refuse it. Once the coin was thrown, she was obligated to follow the man outside the temple and have intercourse with him. After she had paid her debt to the goddess, she was free to go home. Herodotus notes, with his keen eye for human nature, that the beautiful women got this over with quickly. But the less attractive ones, he said, sometimes had to wait in the temple for 3 or 4 years. His descriptions of Babylon are full of such exotic, sensual, and strange rituals. But Herodotus makes a crucial distinction. He saved his true respect for the Persians themselves. He was deeply impressed by the character of the empire's rulers. He marveled at their efficiency. He described the royal road, the great highway that ran for over 1,600 miles. He explained that all along this road, at the distance a horse could travel in one day, were staging posts with fresh horses and riders. A messenger could hand his letter to a new rider, who would gallop to the next post, and so on. In this way, a message could cross the entire empire in a matter of days, not months. It was the Pony Express of the ancient world. Herodotus, in a rare burst of poetic admiration, wrote the line that is now carved on the side of the New York City post office. "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Even more than their efficiency, he admired their values. He wrote that from the age of 5 to 20, Persian noble boys were taught only 3 things: to ride a horse, to shoot a bow, and to tell the truth. This focus on truth was, to Herodotus, their defining virtue. He wrote that the Persians considered lying to be the most disgraceful thing in the world. After lying, the second worst thing was to be in debt, because, as he logically points out, a man who is in debt is also bound to tell lies. He was also fascinated by their religion. Unlike the Greeks, with their flawed human-like gods, and unlike the Egyptians, who built massive temples to animals, the Persians did something different. He noted that they built no statues, no temples, and no altars. They considered it foolish to shut the gods up in a building, as the Greeks did. Instead, he wrote, the Persians went to the tops of the highest mountains. And there, they worshipped the great forces of nature itself. They worshipped the sky, the sun, the moon, the wind, and the earth. Herodotus had now seen the 2 great centers of human civilization: the ancient, mystical traditions of Egypt and the modern, efficient power of Persia. He had investigated their customs, their beliefs, and their character. But to complete his picture of the world, he had to see what lay beyond the borders of civilization. He needed to find the barbarians in their own element. He turned his attention north, to the vast, cold, and empty plains by the Black Sea. He set out to find the Scythians. From the centers of civilization, Herodotus now sought its absolute opposite. He traveled north to the cold, vast, and treeless grasslands that stretched around the Black Sea, a land the Greeks called ScythIA. This was a world defined not by walls and buildings, but by the endless grass and the biting wind. It is unlikely that Herodotus himself traveled deep into the steppe. He was a man of the Mediterranean, a man of cities. Instead, he did what he always did. He went to the edge, to the place where the 2 worlds met. He visited the Greek trading colonies on the northern coast of the Black Sea, cities like Olbia. In these frontier towns, he interviewed the Greek merchants who traded wine and pottery for Scythian grain and slaves. And he interviewed the Scythians themselves, the fierce bearded horsemen who came to the ports to trade. And the stories he collected painted a picture of a people unlike any he had ever known. If Egypt and Persia were complex, organized societies, the Scythians were what a Greek would consider the ultimate barbarians. They were proud nomads. They had no cities, no farms, no written laws. Herodotus writes that they have no fixed dwellings, but are all horsemen and archers, living not from agriculture, but from their cattle, and their homes are on their wagons. They were the masters of the horse and the composite bow. They were, in essence, an anti-civilization. They looked upon men who lived in cities with contempt, and this very lack of structure made them invincible. Herodotus tells in great detail how the mighty Persian king Darius, father of Xerxes, had once tried to invade Scythia. The Scythians simply retreated. They disappeared into the endless steppe, luring the massive Persian army deeper and deeper into an empty land, poisoning the wells and burning the grasslands behind them. The Persians, starving and exhausted, were forced to retreat in humiliation. The Scythians had proven that a people with no cities could not be conquered. Herodotus was fascinated by their customs, which he reported with a mixture of shock and respect. He noted that while Greeks drank wine mixed with water, the Scythians drank it pure and strong, a sign of their wild nature. He reported that a Scythian warrior would drink the blood of the first man he killed. He would cut off the heads of all his enemies and present them to his king. He would even, Herodotus claims, skin the hands of his dead enemies and use the skin as hand towels. But of all the customs he recorded, two stand out as his most vivid and disturbing. The first was the burial of a Scythian king. When a king died, Herodotus explains, his body was not treated like an Egyptian one. They would take the king, cut open his belly, and clean it out. They would fill the cavity with crushed spices, perfume, and herbs, and then sew it back up. Then they would cover the body in wax. This preserved body was then placed on a wagon, and it began a great, terrible procession. The wagon was paraded to every neighboring tribe that the king had ruled. At each stop, the people of the tribe would greet the dead king with a ritual of extreme mourning. They would cut off a piece of their ear, shave their hair, slice their arms, and pierce their left hand with an arrow. This grim journey would last for 40 days, until the wagon finally arrived at the king's burial place, a remote spot in the vast grasslands. There, the people would dig a massive square pit. They would lower the king's body into the pit and place it on a mattress of straw. On one side of him, they would plant spears in the ground. And then the true horror began. They would take one of the king's concubines, his favorite one, and they would strangle her and lay her beside him in the grave. Then they would take his chief cupbearer, his cook, his groom, his personal messenger, and his horses. They would strangle all of them and place them in the pit as well to serve their master in the afterlife. The pit was then filled, and a great mound of earth was piled high above it. But the ritual was not over. They waited 1 full year. When the anniversary came, the Scythians returned to the tomb. They took the 50 finest young men who had been in the king's personal service, and the 50 finest horses. They killed all of them. They gutted the horses and stuffed them with straw, sewing them back up. They gutted the men. Then they would impale the horses on great stakes, arranging them in a perfect circle around the tomb. And they would impale the 50 dead warriors, one on top of each horse, as if they were riding. And there this circle of 50 dead horsemen would remain, a silent, gruesome honor guard, protecting the king's mound for all time. This was the Scythian character, as Herodotus saw it. Violent, loyal, and utterly alien. But he also recorded another ritual, one of purification, that is just as famous. He reports that the Scythians never bathed with water. The very idea was repulsive to them. They never by any chance, he wrote, washed their bodies with water. Instead, he says, they had a special vapor bath. They would build a small tent by stretching thick felt blankets over 3 poles stuck in the ground. They would seal all the cracks as tightly as possible. Inside this tiny tent, they would place a large bowl filled with red-hot stones. Once the tent was hot and sealed, the Scythians would crawl inside. Then they would take the seeds of a special plant, a plant he calls cannabis. They would throw these cannabis seeds onto the red-hot stones. The effect, Herodotus reports, was immediate. A thick, fragrant vapor would rise from the stones, greater than any Greek steam bath. The Scythians, he says, delighted, shout for joy as they sat in this intoxicating cloud. This ritual, he concluded, serves them instead of a bath. Herodotus had now seen it all. The ancient, God-obsessed traditions of Egypt, the organized, truth-telling bureaucracy of Persia, and the wild, nomadic, and invincible ferocity of the Scythians. He had gathered his evidence. He had completed his investigation of the known world. Now, he was ready to tackle the great question that had started his entire journey. He had all the pieces. He understood the character of all the great players. It was time to explain why these 3 great worlds, the Greek, the Persian, and the barbarian, had collided in the most spectacular war the world had ever seen. He was ready to write his masterpiece. He had returned from his great journeys. He had seen the ancient mystery of Egypt, the organized power of Persia, and the wild liberty of ScythIA. He was now a man in his middle age, perhaps living for a time in Athens, a city buzzing with new ideas and intellectual energy. And here, he began to assemble his life's work. He called it the Histories, or the Inquiries. And he began it with a sentence that would change how humans saw themselves forever. This is the display of the inquiry of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, so that things done by man may not be forgotten in time, and that great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by the Greeks, some by the barbarians, may not lose their kleos. That single word, kleos, is a key. It is the Greek word for glory or fame, the renown that heroes win in battle. Herodotus was, first, a preserver. He wanted to save the great deeds of both sides from being erased by time. But his work was not a simple list. It was driven by that single question that had sparked his journey. Why? Why did these 2 worlds, the East and the West, collide? He does not begin his story with the war itself. He does not start with the Battle of Marathon or the great invasion of Xerxes. He begins, instead, like a philosopher, looking for the first cause of the conflict. And he does not trace it to a border dispute or a trade war. He traces it to the human heart. He traces it to a clash of personalities, to arrogance, and to fate. His story begins with a man named Croesus. Croesus was the king of Lydia, a wealthy kingdom in what is now Turkey. In fact, Herodotus tells us, the Lydians were the very first people in the world to invent and use gold and silver coinage. And King Croesus was the richest man alive. He was, literally, as rich as Croesus. Croesus sat on his throne in his capital city of Sardis, surrounded by his limitless gold, and he believed with all his heart that he was the happiest man on earth. And he needed the world's wisest man to confirm it. At that time, the great Athenian lawgiver Solon was traveling the world, having completed his reforms in his home city. Croesus insisted that Solon visit his palace. He gave him a grand tour, showing him the treasury rooms, piled high with glittering gold and silver. When the tour was over, Croesus finally asked his question. "My Athenian guest, I have heard much of your wisdom. Tell me, who is the happiest man you have ever seen?" He sat back expecting Solon to name him. Solon, who was not impressed by wealth, answered plainly, "Tellus of Athens." Croesus was shocked. "Tellus? Who is Tellus?" Solon explained. Tellus was a man who lived in a prosperous city. He had good children, and he lived long enough to see his grandchildren, all of whom survived. But most importantly, he died a glorious death. In a battle against a neighboring city, he led the charge, routed the enemy, and died on the field of victory. His city honored him with a magnificent state funeral, burying him on the spot where he fell. Annoyed, Croesus pushed again. "All right, Tellus is the happiest. But who is the second happiest? Surely that is me." "Cleobes and Biton," Solon replied. Croesus was even more frustrated. "Who are they?" Solon told the story. They were two young men from the city of Argos. Their mother was a priestess, and she needed to get to the temple for a festival. But her oxen were still in the fields and were late. So her two strong sons, Cleobes and Biton, yoked themselves to the heavy cart, and they pulled their mother for 5 miles, all the way to the temple. The entire city gathered and praised the young men for their strength and their devotion. Their mother, filled with overwhelming pride, stood before the goddess's statue and prayed. She asked the goddess to give her sons the greatest gift a mortal could possibly receive. The goddess answered. The two young men, tired from their labor, lay down in the temple. They fell asleep, and they never woke up. They died in that perfect moment, at the absolute peak of their youth, their glory, and their piety. Now Croesus was genuinely angry. "My Athenian guest," he said, "what about me? Is my vast wealth and my happiness worth so little that you place me lower than these common men?" And here, Solon gave Croesus the great lesson of the book. "O king," he said, "the gods are jealous of great human happiness, and they love to cause disruption. In a long life, a man sees and suffers many things he would rather not. The future is uncertain and full of chance. Man is a creature of circumstance. Therefore, I can call no man happy until I know the manner of his death." Croesus dismissed Solon as a fool and sent him away. But Herodotus has just introduced the great theme of his entire masterpiece: hubris. It is the Greek word for a dangerous, intoxicating arrogance. It is the pride that makes a mortal man think he is as stable as a god. And Herodotus shows us the nemesis, the divine punishment, the turn of fate that always follows. Croesus's fall came swiftly. He watched with concern the rise of a new dynamic power on his eastern border. The Persians, led by their brilliant and terrifying king, Cyrus the Great. Filled with his own hubris, believing himself to be the most powerful man on earth, Croesus decided he should attack the Persians first. But he wanted to be sure. He famously decided to test all the great oracles of the world. He sent messengers to every major shrine, to Delphi, to Dodona, and even to Egypt. He told them that on the 100th day from their departure, they should ask the oracle a simple question. What is King Croesus, son of Aliats, doing right now? The oracles gave various, vague answers. But when the messenger entered the shrine at Delphi, the priestess, the Pythia, chanted in verse, "I can count the grains of sand and the measures of the sea. I understand the speech of the dumb and hear the one who does not speak. A smell has come to my senses of a hard-shelled tortoise, boiling in a bronze cauldron with the flesh of a lamb. Bronze is the pot beneath, and bronze is the lid above." When this message was brought back to Croesus, he was stunned. Trying to think of the most impossible, ridiculous thing to guess, he had spent that day chopping up a tortoise and a lamb and boiling them together in a bronze pot. The oracle at Delphi was the real deal. Now, trusting Delphi completely, he sent his real question. He sent messengers with vast gifts of gold. They asked the oracle, should King Croesus attack the Persians? The oracle gave its most famous and terrible answer. If Croesus crosses the Halys River, he will destroy a great empire. This was all Croesus needed to hear. He was overjoyed. He gathered his massive army, crossed the Halys River, and attacked the Persians. He was immediately and catastrophically defeated by Cyrus. The Persian army overran his kingdom, captured his capital, and took him prisoner. The great empire he destroyed was his own. Herodotus ends the story with Croesus as a prisoner, bound on top of a great funeral pyre that Cyrus had built. As the flames began to lick the wood, Croesus, in his despair, finally understood the wisdom of the Athenian. He cried out, "Solon! Solon! Solon!" Cyrus, intrigued, ordered the fire to be put out and asked what he meant. Croesus told him the story, and Cyrus, in a moment of profound recognition, realizing that he too was a mortal man subject to the same violent turns of fate, spared Croesus's life. With this single, brilliant story, Herodotus has set his stage. He has shown how arrogance leads to ruin. He has shown how fate is inescapable. And he has set the first domino. For by conquering Lydia, Cyrus the Great and the Persian Empire now controlled the Greek cities of Ionia, on the coast. The two worlds had touched. The friction that would lead to the Great War had begun. The fall of King Croesus set the great conflict in motion. The Persian Empire, having swallowed Lydia, now expanded to the Aegean Sea. For the first time, a single great Eastern power now ruled directly over the restless, freedom-loving Greek cities of the Ionian coast. Herodotus's own hometown of Halicarnassus was one of them. For a generation, this uneasy arrangement held. The Persians ruled with a relatively light touch. They did not demand religious conversion. They mostly just demanded two things: taxes and soldiers. But they governed the Greek cities by installing local Greek tyrants, strongmen who were loyal to the Persian king. This system bred resentment. And the main story moves forward about 50 years, to around 499 BC. The great king Cyrus was dead, and the Persian Empire was now ruled by a new king, Darius the Great. Herodotus introduces us to the man who, in his view, lit the fuse. He was a Greek named Aristagoras, the clever, ambitious, and slightly desperate tyrant of the Ionian city of Miletus. Aristagoras had gotten himself into trouble. He had wasted Persian money and resources on a failed military expedition to capture the island of Naxos. He knew he was about to be punished by his Persian masters. To save himself, he decided on a reckless gamble. He would incite all the Ionian cities to revolt against Persia, transforming his personal failure into a glorious war for Greek freedom. He knew he couldn't do it alone. The Ionians were rich, but they were not warriors. To challenge the might of Persia, they needed help from the two most powerful city-states on the Greek mainland, Sparta and Athens. First, Aristagoras sailed to Sparta. He brought with him a map of the known world, engraved on a bronze tablet, a fascinating high-tech gadget for its day. He met with the Spartan king, Cleomenes. He unrolled his map and began his sales pitch. He pointed to the Ionian cities, reminding the king that they were fellow Greeks, now enslaved by barbarians. Then he pointed to the vast, rich lands of the Persian Empire. He told the Spartans that the Persians were weak fighters. He said they fought in trousers, with soft hats, and that their armies would be easy to defeat. He tempted Cleomenes with the incredible riches of the Persian capital Susa, saying, "You can be the richest men in the world." The Spartan king was intrigued. He asked only one practical question: this capital city of Susa, how long would it take to march there from the coast? Aristagoras, in his eagerness, made a fatal mistake. He told the truth. "It is a journey of 3 months," he said. Cleomenes' reaction was immediate. "Get out of Sparta before sunset, Milesian stranger," he snapped. The very idea of marching the famously homebound Spartan army 3 months away from their city, deep into enemy territory, was pure insanity to him. Rejected, Aristagoras went to his second choice, Athens. The political situation in Athens was completely different. The Athenians had just overthrown their own tyrant and established the world's first democracy. They were filled with a new and defiant sense of their own freedom. And they hated the Persians, who had recently tried to help their exiled tyrant get back into power. When Aristagoras made his pitch, the Athenians were far more receptive. He told them the same stories of Persian weakness and Ionian brotherhood. This time, he found his audience. The young, radical Athenian democracy voted to help. But they were cautious. They did not send their whole army. They sent a small squadron of ships. Herodotus writes the fateful line, "The Athenians sent a fleet of 20 ships. These ships were the beginning of troubles, both for the Greeks and for the barbarians." It was a tiny gesture, but it changed the world. The Ionian rebels, now bolstered by the Athenian soldiers, marched inland to the city of Sardis, the old capital of King Croesus, now the regional headquarters of the Persian Empire. They stormed the lower city and by accident, a soldier set fire to a reed on a roof. A catastrophic fire began. The entire city, including its most sacred temples, was burned to the ground. The Athenian soldiers, having achieved nothing but destruction, got back on their ships and sailed home. But the damage was done. When King Darius, in his palace at Susa, received the news, he was enraged. He was not angry at the Ionians. He expected them to rebel. He was furious at this unknown, insignificant city of Athenians, who had dared to cross the sea and burn his city. Herodotus gives us a magnificent, dramatic scene. Darius asked his servants, "Who are these Athenians?" After being told, he picked up his bow and shot an arrow high into the sky, crying out to his god, "O Ahura Mazda, grant that I may have my revenge on the Athenians." And so he would not forget his new purpose. He commanded one of his servants to stand before him every single day, at every meal, and to say 3 times, "Master, remember the Athenians." The Ionian revolt was eventually crushed. The city of Miletus was burned, its people killed or enslaved. Aristagoras himself was killed in a minor battle. But King Darius did not forget his oath. His gaze was now fixed on the Greek mainland. He saw it as a fractured, chaotic, and impudent land that needed to be brought under the order of the Persian Empire. The beginning of troubles was over. The Great War was about to begin. King Darius did not take the news of Marathon well. His servant no longer needed to remind him, "Master, remember the Athenians." The humiliation of this defeat, inflicted by a tiny amateur army of citizen soldiers, turned his anger into a burning obsession. He declared that this time, he would not send his generals. He would lead the invasion himself. And he would not just punish Athens. He would enslave all of Greece. He began preparations for an invasion so massive it would make the Marathon force look like a scouting party. For 3 years, the empire buzzed with the sound of recruitment, shipbuilding, and the gathering of supplies. But Herodotus, once again, shows the hand of fate intervening. First, Egypt, which had been conquered by the Persians, exploded in a massive revolt, forcing Darius to divide his attention. And then, in the midst of preparing for 2 wars at once, the great king Darius died. The throne and the oath of revenge now passed to his son, Xerxes. Xerxes, Herodotus tells us, was a different kind of man. He was tall, handsome, and born into the ultimate privilege of absolute power. He had not built the empire, he had inherited it. And he was surrounded by advisors who told him that he was, essentially, a living god. At first, Herodotus says, Xerxes was not interested in the Athenian problem. He was focused on crushing the revolt in Egypt. But a key advisor, his cousin Mardonius, the same general whose fleet had been wrecked in the first expedition, pushed him relentlessly. Mardonius argued that the honor of the empire was at stake. He argued that Greece was a rich land, ripe for the taking. Xerxes, his pride stoked, was convinced. He would not just finish his father's work. He would exceed it. He would assemble an army and a navy so vast, it would blot out the sun. For the next 4 years, he gathered his forces. And this is where Herodotus's investigation shines. He does not just say the army was big. He gives us the order of battle. He lists the nations one by one that came to join the Great Crusade. There were the Persians and the Medes, in their armor and trousers, carrying wicker shields. There were the Assyrians, with their bronze helmets and iron-studded clubs. There were the Bactrians, with their bows made of cane. There were the Indians wearing clothes made of cotton, carrying bows that shot iron-tipped arrows. There were the Ethiopians, draped in leopard skins, their bodies painted half white and half red, armed with stone-tipped arrows. There were the Libyans in their leather gear, and the Arabians with their long flowing robes. It was, as Herodotus describes it, not an army. It was all of Asia on the march. He claims the final land army numbered 1.7 million men, and the fleet over 1,200 ships. Modern historians believe these numbers are a wild exaggeration. The logistical reality of feeding and watering such a force was an impossibility. The real number was likely closer to 200,000 or 300,000. But to the Greeks who saw it coming, it felt like 1.7 million. It was the largest invasion force in human history. This massive army was not just a tool of war. It was an expression of Xerxes's personality. It was a demonstration of hubris, that dangerous, divine arrogance. And Xerxes began his invasion with 2 acts of engineering so audacious. They were, in essence, an attack on the gods themselves. First, he remembered the fate of Mardonius's fleet, which had been destroyed by a storm while trying to sail around the treacherous peninsula of Mount Athos. Xerxes decided he would not risk sailing around the mountain. He would sail through it. He put his engineers to work, and for 3 years, his army dug a massive canal 1.5 miles long, straight through the base of the peninsula. It was wide enough for 2 warships to pass, side by side. It was an act of staggering arrogance. Xerxes was reshaping the very earth, proving that nature itself must bend to his will. His second act was even more famous. To get his massive land army from Asia into Europe, he had to cross the Hellespont, the strait of water separating the 2 continents. He ordered his engineers to build a magnificent bridge of boats. They lashed hundreds of ships together, side by side, from one shore to the other. But just as they finished, a powerful storm blew in. The winds and the current tore the bridge to pieces. Xerxes fell into a fit of insane rage. He was furious, not at his engineers, but at the water. He had been defied by the Hellespont itself. He ordered his soldiers to punish the sea. Herodotus reports that he commanded them to strike the water with whips 300 times. As they whipped the waves, they were ordered to shout, "O bitter water! Your master lays this punishment upon you for daring to wrong him. King Xerxes will cross you, whether you like it or not." As a final, insane insult, he ordered his men to throw a pair of golden chains or fetters into the water, as if he were enslaving the sea. Then, he had the engineers who had built the bridge beheaded. A new bridge was built, a double bridge of over 600 ships, anchored against the current. And for 7 days and 7 nights, without pause, the army of Asia crossed over into Europe. Herodotus says that Xerxes sat on a marble throne on the shore, watching them. And in that moment, in his greatest triumph, Herodotus gives us a flash of the king's complex character. As he watched the millions of men, the glittering armor, and the endless line of ships, Xerxes did not cheer. He wept. His uncle Artabanus, who was nearby, asked him why he was crying. Xerxes replied, "I was struck by a sudden feeling of pity. I was thinking of the shortness of all human life. Of all these men, so many in number, not one will be alive in 100 years." It was a flicker of awareness, a moment of tragic insight. But it passed. The bridge was crossed. The canal was dug. The land of Greece lay ahead, small, divided, and terrified. The greatest war of the ancient world had begun. Herodotus's great work, the Histories, goes on to describe this monumental war in epic detail. He is the single source for the most famous stories of Western civilization. He tells the story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, led by their doomed king, Leonidas. He tells the story of the brilliant, complex Athenian general Themistocles, who tricked Xerxes into destroying his own fleet in the narrow straits of Salamis. And he tells of the final, brutal land battle at Plataea, where the combined Greek army, led by the Spartans, finally broke the Persian invasion. He recorded the great Kleos, the glory of the Greeks. But he also, and this is crucial, recorded the bravery, the character, and the nobility of the Persians. He presented the speeches of Persian generals. He praised the courage of warriors like Artemisia, the queen of his own hometown, who fought for Xerxes. In a world that had just been through a brutal us versus them conflict, Herodotus dared to write a book that was about everyone. He saved the great deeds of both sides from being erased by time. And when he finally completed this masterpiece, perhaps reciting it publicly in the great intellectual center of Athens, the reaction was not what you might expect. He was not universally celebrated. In fact, he was immediately and sharply criticized. His first critics were his fellow Greeks. They were furious at his objectivity. They had expected a simple patriotic song of praise, a story of how the noble Greeks defeated the evil, savage barbarians. Instead, Herodotus gave them a complex, nuanced story of human folly, arrogance, and tragedy on both sides. He had praised the Persians for their ability to tell the truth. He had admired their efficient bureaucracy. He wrote with clear respect for Persian leaders and warriors. To the Athenians and Spartans, who had sacrificed everything in the war, this was baffling. It was offensive. He was given a nickname. It was not a compliment. They called him Philobarbaros, the barbarian lover. In their eyes, he had failed the first test of a historian, to be a good propagandist for his own side. His second and most powerful critic was the next great Greek historian, Thucydides. Thucydides was a general, a politician, and a hard-nosed, scientific thinker. He was writing the history of the next great war, the Peloponnesian War, between Athens and Sparta. Thucydides, in his writing, needed to establish his own authority, and he did it by implicitly attacking Herodotus's methods. Thucydides never mentions Herodotus by name. He didn't have to. In the introduction to his own book, Thucydides wrote that his work was not a performance piece, designed to win the applause of the moment. This was a direct shot at Herodotus, who famously did give public recitals of his stories. Thucydides wrote that he would not include the myth-like or the fabulous to make his story more entertaining. This was a direct shot at Herodotus's stories of Croesus and Solon, or the supernatural intervention of the gods. Thucydides wanted to know the politics of war, the speeches, the troop movements, the finances. Herodotus wanted to know the humanity of the world, the customs, the beliefs, the stories, the character. To the serious mind of Thucydides, Herodotus's work was unscientific and frivolous. As the centuries passed, this criticism grew louder. Roman writers, and later Greeks like the famous essayist Plutarch, began to attack him openly. Plutarch wrote an entire essay called On the Malice of Herodotus, accusing him of deliberately lying and slandering the good names of certain Greek cities. The man whom some called the father of history was now being openly called the father of lies. So why, then, do we remember him today as a genius? Because his critics were profoundly wrong. They were attacking him for the very things that made him revolutionary. They criticized him for including the strange customs of foreign lands. But today we call that anthropology. They criticized him for recording the local legends and oral traditions of the people he met. But today we call that folklore and oral history. They criticized him for his grand sweeping theory about the clash between the East and West. But today we call that geopolitics. And most of all, they criticized him for his incredible, fantastical stories, which they assumed were lies. Stories like the Egyptian method of mummification. Stories of giant, fur-covered ants in India that dug up gold. Or his most famous lie. Herodotus tells the story of Phoenician sailors, hired by an Egyptian pharaoh, who attempted to sail all the way around Africa. The journey took years. When they returned, they reported a single bizarre detail. They claimed that as they were sailing west around the southern tip of the continent, the sun was on their right hand or starboard side. This, to any Greek, was a physical impossibility. The sun always crosses the sky to the south, on the left. Herodotus himself, recording the story, adds a famous note. "I do not believe this story," he writes, "but I am bound to report what I was told." But that one impossible detail, which Herodotus himself did not believe, is the single greatest proof that the journey actually happened. If you cross the equator and enter the southern hemisphere, the sun does cross the sky to the north. When you sail west, it would be on your right. Time and time again, modern science has proven Herodotus right. His lies have turned out to be truths he had the honesty to record, even when he couldn't understand them. His detailed report on mummification, once thought to be a fantasy, was proven to be precisely, chemically accurate by modern archaeology. Even his gold-digging ants are now believed to be a factual report of the large, furry marmots of the Himalayas, who would dig up gold-bearing soil from their burrows. He was not the father of lies. He was the father of investigation. His job was not to tell his audience what to believe. His job was to tell them, with honesty and an open mind, everything he had found. His work was done. He had given his great inquiry to the world, a gift that would be argued about for the next 2,500 years. But what of the man himself? Herodotus did not spend his final days in Athens, the city that had criticized him as a barbarian lover. He was, and always had been, a man of the crossroads, a man who belonged to the whole Greek world, not just one city. And in his later life, he found a home that was as idealistic and broad-minded as he was. The great Athenian statesman Pericles had a grand idea. He wanted to found a new, perfect city in southern Italy, on the site of the ruined city of Sybaris. This new city would be a model for the future. It would be called ScythIA, and it was to be a pan-Hellenic colony. This meant that Greeks from all cities, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and the islands, were invited to come and live together as equal citizens. It was an attempt to create a united Greek identity, to build a future based on cooperation, not rivalry. For Herodotus, the man who had grown up between cultures, the man who had written with respect for all peoples, this was the perfect home. He was invited to be one of the original citizens, and he accepted. This is where he likely spent his final quiet years. We can picture him, now an old man, living in the warm Italian sun, far from the growing political storm clouds that were gathering over Athens and Sparta. He was a respected elder in a new city, and it was here, in the Peace of ScythIA, that he almost certainly did his final edits, polishing and perfecting the one great manuscript that contained his entire life. His death is a mystery. There is no grand story. There are no dramatic final words, like those he gave to his characters. Sometime around the year 425 BC, at the approximate age of 60, The man who had traveled the world and invented history simply died. His grave is lost. He left no dynasty. He built no empire. He conquered no one. But he had done something far more permanent. He had created a new way of seeing. Before Herodotus, the past was a list of kings, a set of divine myths, or a heroic poem. It was something you were told, something you memorized. Herodotus turned the past into a question. He made it a place to be investigated. He gave us the tools. Go and see for yourself. Talk to people. Listen to their stories, even the ones you don't believe. Compare the traditions of different nations. Look for the cause. Look for the human motive. He was not just the first historian. He was the first anthropologist, the first travel writer, and the first true global journalist. His ultimate legacy is not the facts he got right, or even the fantastic stories he got wrong. His legacy is the spirit that drove him. It is the spirit of Historia, of relentless, radical, and open-minded inquiry. He proved that a person's customs are not a measure of their rightness or wrongness, but simply a fascinating part of the human story. He taught the world that the only way to truly understand yourself is to have the courage and the empathy to try and understand others. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the exile, the traveler, the barbarian lover, did not just save the past from being forgotten. He gave it a living voice, and he taught us once and for all how to listen.